In the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, where tourists now wander among toppled columns and ancient stones, lies one of history's most enduring mysteries. This place, the Roman Forum, was once the beating heart of an empire that would reshape the Western world. But before the marble temples, before the triumphal arches, before the senators and emperors, there was something else here. Something simpler. Perhaps just a collection of muddy huts on a hilltop, home to shepherds and farmers who could never have imagined what their settlement would become. The question of how Rome began has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and storytellers for more than 2,000 years. Was it founded by twin brothers, sons of a god, raised by a wolf? Or did it emerge slowly, organically, from the gradual merger of Iron Age villages? The answer, as we'll discover, is neither simple nor singular. Rome's foundation exists in a strange twilight zone between myth and history, where archaeological evidence meets ancient legend, where verifiable facts brush against divine intervention, and where the truth may be more complex and fascinating than either version alone suggests. Tonight, we're going to explore both stories. The mythological tale that the Romans themselves believed, passed down through generations, written by their greatest poets and historians, and the archaeological reality that modern science has uncovered layer by layer beneath the streets and monuments of the Eternal City. We'll walk the 7 hills, examine the pottery shards and foundation walls, meet legendary kings and historical Etruscan overlords, and try to understand how a small settlement beside the Tiber River became the greatest power the ancient world had ever known. The land before Rome, long before anyone spoke of Romulus or Remus. Long before the name Rome existed at all, the Italian peninsula was home to a patchwork of diverse peoples. The landscape they inhabited was markedly different from the Italy we know today. Thick forests covered much of the terrain. Marshes spread across the lowlands. Wild animals roamed freely through territories that would later become thriving cities and cultivated fields. Around 1,600 years before the Common Era, the area surrounding what would become Rome saw its first permanent human settlements. These weren't cities, not even close. They were small clusters of dwellings, often built on hilltops for defensive purposes, inhabited by people who practiced a mix of hunting, gathering, and rudimentary agriculture. By 1,000 years before the Common Era, as the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age, these settlements had evolved significantly. The archaeological record shows us a culture known as the Villanovan civilization, named after the town of Villanova near Bologna, where its characteristic artifacts were first discovered in the 19th century. The Villanovan people practiced cremation of their dead, placing the ashes in distinctive biconical urns decorated with geometric patterns. These urns, made of impasto clay and often shaped like miniature houses, tell us something profound about how these people lived. They weren't nomads anymore. They had established communities, built permanent structures, and developed artistic traditions that would be passed down through generations. In the region of Latium, where Rome would eventually rise, the Villanovan culture manifested as what scholars call the Latial culture. This was the world of the Latins, one of many Italic peoples inhabiting the peninsula. The Latins spoke an early form of the Latin language, a branch of the Indo-European language family. They weren't the only inhabitants of this region. To their north lived the mysterious Etruscans, a sophisticated civilization whose origins remain debated to this day. To their east and south were other Italic tribes, the Sabines, the Oscans, the Umbrians, the Samnites. Each group had its own language, customs, and territorial claims. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought. Often they intermarried and influenced one another's cultures. The Latins themselves weren't unified. They lived in separate communities scattered throughout Latium, each centered on a fortified hilltop settlement. According to later Roman tradition, there were originally 30 of these Latin towns, united in a loose confederation called the Latin League. They shared a common language, common religious practices, and a common sanctuary. The temple of Jupiter Latiaris on the Alban Mount, where they gathered annually for a festival that reinforced their ethnic and cultural bonds. Among these Latin settlements, one stood out, Alba Longa. Located in the Alban Hills, about 20 kilometers southeast of where Rome would stand, Alba Longa held a special status. The Romans would later claim it as their mother city, the place from which their founders came. Whether Alba Longa truly existed as the powerful city-state of legend remains uncertain. Archaeological evidence suggests that during the early Iron Age, the Alban Hills hosted several small villages rather than a single urbanized center. These villages had their own necropolises, their own sacred spaces, their own local identities. Perhaps one of these villages was Alba Longa. Or perhaps Alba Longa was a legendary creation, a way for the Romans to give themselves a more ancient and prestigious lineage. What we can say with certainty is that by the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, permanent settlements existed on the hills that would become Rome. The Palatine Hill, in particular, shows clear evidence of habitation. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of wattle and daub huts, circular or oval structures with thatched roofs. These were simple dwellings, nothing like the marble palaces that would one day crown this same hill. But they were homes. People lived here, raised families here, buried their dead in the nearby necropolis. The Capitoline Hill, rising to the northwest of the Palatine, also hosted early settlements. So did the Quirinal Hill, further to the northeast. These weren't yet parts of a single unified city. They were separate communities, probably with their own leaders, their own identities. The valley between them, where the Forum would eventually sprawl, was marshy and flood-prone, unsuitable for habitation. It may have been used as a burial ground, as cemetery sites from this period have been discovered there. This was the world into which Rome would be born. A landscape of small hilltop villages, pastoral communities living in a frontier zone between different ethnic groups and competing powers. The Etruscans to the north were already developing into a sophisticated urban civilization, with impressive engineering skills and extensive trade networks reaching across the Mediterranean. The Greeks were establishing colonies in southern Italy and Sicily, bringing with them their alphabet, their art, their mythology. The Latins of central Italy existed somewhere between these two spheres of influence, absorbing elements from both while maintaining their own distinct identity. The strategic importance of this particular location, where Rome would emerge, cannot be overstated. The Tiber River provided access to the sea, enabling trade and communication. The river was also fordable at this point, especially near the Tiber Island, making it a natural crossing point for overland routes. Salt from the coastal marshes was transported inland along what would become known as the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, passing through this very area. Control of this crossing meant control of valuable trade. The hills themselves offered natural defensive positions. Any settlement built on high ground could spot approaching enemies from a distance and had the advantage of height in any conflict. The soil in the surrounding plains was fertile, suitable for growing grain, tending vines, raising livestock. Fresh water was abundant. All the basic requirements for a thriving community were present. And so, sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era, something began to happen here. Whether through the actions of a single heroic founder, as legend would claim, or through the gradual coalescing of separate villages into a larger polity, a new power was emerging. The story of how this happened, or at least how the Romans would remember it happening, begins not in Italy at all, but across the Mediterranean, in the burning ruins of Troy. The mythological foundation, Aeneas and the Trojan connection. Every great civilization needs an origin story, and the Romans crafted theirs with care. By the time of the late Roman Republic and early Empire, when the poet Virgil wrote his masterpiece, the Aeneid, and the historian Livy penned his monumental history of Rome, the city's mythological foundation had been fully developed. It was a story that connected Rome to the heroic age of Greek legend, that gave the Romans divine ancestry, and that explained their perceived destiny to rule the world. The tale begins with the Trojan War, that legendary conflict between the Greeks and the city of Troy that had been immortalized in Homer's Iliad. According to the myth, when Troy fell to the Greeks after a 10-year siege, most of the city's inhabitants perished in the flames. But one man escaped, Aeneas, a Trojan prince, son of the mortal Anchises and the goddess Venus, known to the Greeks as Aphrodite. As Troy burned, Aeneas fought valiantly to defend his homeland. But the gods had other plans for him. His mother, Venus, appeared to him and commanded him to flee, telling him that the fates had reserved a greater destiny for him and his descendants. Carrying his aged father on his back and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand, Aeneas made his way through the burning streets to the harbor, where he and a group of fellow survivors boarded ships and set sail into the unknown. What followed was a journey that would rival that of Odysseus. Aeneas and his followers wandered the Mediterranean for years, seeking the land where the fates decreed they should settle. They stopped in Thrace, only to flee when warned away by an ominous sign. They visited Delos, where the oracle told them cryptically to seek out their ancient mother. Believing this meant Crete, from which some legends said the Trojan royal family had originated, they sailed there and attempted to establish a colony. But disease and crop failure drove them away. The household gods appeared to Aeneas in a dream, clarifying that the oracle had meant Italy, the homeland of Dardanus, an even more ancient ancestor of the Trojan line. The journey continued. They encountered the Harpies, vicious winged creatures who defiled their food and prophesied future hardships. They landed on the coast of Epirus, where they were welcomed by Helenus, a Trojan prince who had survived the war and made a new life among the Greeks. Helenus, who had the gift of prophecy, gave Aeneas detailed instructions for reaching Italy and warned him of the dangers he would face. As they sailed along the coast of Sicily, they passed between the twin terrors of Scylla and Charybdis, the same monsters that had threatened Odysseus. They landed on Sicily's shore, where they discovered a Greek sailor, one of Odysseus's companions, who had been abandoned there when the hero fled from the Cyclops Polyphemus. The Trojans rescued this unfortunate man, then quickly departed as the monstrous Cyclopes, including the blinded Polyphemus himself, came down to the shore. On Sicily, Aeneas lost his father Anchises, who died of old age. Grief-stricken, Aeneas held elaborate funeral games in his father's honor. But there was no time for extended mourning. The journey had to continue. Setting sail once more, the Trojan fleet was caught in a terrible storm, apparently sent by the goddess Juno, who harbored an ancient grudge against the Trojans and feared the destiny that awaited their descendants. The storm drove them to the coast of North Africa, where they were welcomed by Dido, the queen of Carthage. Dido was herself a refugee, having fled from her homeland of Tyre after her brother murdered her husband. She had founded Carthage and was building it into a great city. When she met Aeneas, she fell deeply in love with him, and he with her. For a time, Aeneas forgot his mission and lived contentedly in Carthage as Dido's consort. But the gods intervened once again. Jupiter sent Mercury to remind Aeneas of his duty. He was destined to reach Italy, to found a new civilization. His personal happiness had to be sacrificed to this greater purpose. Heartbroken but resolute, Aeneas ordered his men to prepare the ships for departure. When Dido discovered he was leaving, she pleaded with him to stay, but he refused, claiming he had no choice but to obey the gods. In her grief and rage, Dido cursed Aeneas and his descendants, prophesying eternal war between Carthage and Rome. Then she killed herself on a funeral pyre as the Trojan ships sailed away. Finally, after all these trials, Aeneas reached Italy. He landed at Cumae, on the western coast near modern Naples, where the famous Sibyl, a prophetess, had her cave. The Sibyl guided Aeneas to the underworld, where he could speak with the shade of his dead father. In this mysterious realm of the dead, Anchises showed Aeneas visions of the future. He saw the long line of his descendants, the great heroes who would be born from his line, and the glorious city of Rome that would one day rule the world. Fortified by this knowledge of his destiny, Aeneas returned to the world of the living. He then sailed further north to the coast of Latium, landing near the mouth of the Tiber River. Here, the mythological narrative takes on a more detailed form as the Trojans encounter the native peoples of Italy. Latium was ruled by a king named Latinus, who welcomed the strangers peacefully. An oracle had told Latinus that his daughter Lavinia was destined to marry a foreign prince, whose descendants would raise his name to the stars. Latinus interpreted this to mean Aeneas and offered him Lavinia's hand in marriage. However, there was a complication. Lavinia had already been promised to Turnus, king of the Rutulians, a neighboring people. Turnus was understandably furious at losing his bride to a Trojan refugee. He rallied the local tribes and declared war on Aeneas and his followers. The war was long and bloody, with losses on both sides. Various Italian peoples joined one side or the other. Aeneas secured an alliance with Evander, a Greek who had established a small settlement on the Palatine Hill called Pallanteum. The war reached its climax in single combat between Aeneas and Turnus. Aeneas emerged victorious, killing his rival and winning both Lavinia and peace with the Latins. He founded a city near the coast, which he named Lavinium after his wife. Here the Trojans and Latins merged into a single people. The survivors of Troy became Italians, bringing their gods, their customs, and their destiny to this new land. After Aeneas' death, his son Ascanius, also called Iulus, founded a new city in the Alban Hills. This was Alba Longa, destined to become the most important city in Latium. Ascanius established a dynasty that would rule Alba Longa for generations. The royal line descended from him filled the chronological gap between the Trojan War and the founding of Rome centuries later. This was not the end of the story, however. It was merely the prelude. According to the developed Roman mythology, The line of Alban kings continued through multiple generations, each king succeeding his father in orderly fashion, until we reach Procas, one of the later rulers. Procas had two sons, Numitor and Amulius. When Procas died, Numitor, being the elder, should have inherited the throne. But Amulius, the younger brother, was ambitious and ruthless. He seized power, imprisoned Numitor, and killed Numitor's male heirs to prevent any future challenges to his rule. Numitor had one surviving child, a daughter named Rhea Silvia. Amulius forced her to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess of the goddess Vesta, who was required to take a vow of chastity. The Vestal virgins tended the sacred fire of Vesta and were expected to remain celibate. By forcing Rhea Silvia into this role, Amulius hoped to ensure that she could never have children who might claim the throne. The plan seemed perfect. Amulius appeared secure in his power. But the gods, or fate, had other plans. And this is where the most famous part of the Roman foundation myth begins, with the miraculous birth of two brothers who would change history forever. Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers. The story of what happened next was known to every Roman child, depicted in countless works of art, retold by poets and historians, and celebrated in religious festivals. It was a story of divine intervention, miraculous survival, brotherly love and betrayal, and the birth of the greatest city the world would ever know. Rhea Silvia, the enforced Vestal virgin and rightful princess of Alba Longa, caught the attention of Mars, the god of war. Different versions of the story provide different accounts of what happened. Some say Mars appeared to her in all his divine glory, and she willingly became his lover. Others, more cynical, suggest that Rhea Silvia was raped by an unknown man and claimed divine paternity to avoid the death penalty for breaking her vow. The historian Livy presents both versions, leaving readers to judge which they find more credible. Whatever the truth, Rhea Silvia became pregnant. For a time, she managed to hide her condition, but eventually it became obvious. When Amulius learned of the pregnancy, he was furious, but also afraid. If the father truly was Mars, as Rhea Silvia claimed, killing the children might bring divine wrath upon him. Yet he couldn't allow the children to live and potentially challenge his throne. When Rhea Silvia gave birth to twin boys, Amulius found a solution that he hoped would satisfy both caution and ambition. He imprisoned Rhea Silvia and ordered a servant to take the infants to the Tiber River and drown them. However, the servant took pity on the helpless babies. Instead of actively killing them, he placed them in a basket and set them adrift on the river, leaving their fate to the gods. The river, swollen with rain, carried the basket downstream. Eventually, it came to rest at the base of the Palatine Hill, near a sacred fig tree known as the Ficus Ruminalis. Here, according to the most famous version of the legend, a she-wolf discovered the abandoned infants. Instead of devouring them, as one might expect a wild animal to do, the she-wolf nursed them with her own milk. A woodpecker, another animal sacred to Mars, brought them food. This miraculous image of the she-wolf nursing the twins would become one of Rome's most enduring symbols, replicated in countless statues and artworks throughout Roman history and beyond. It represented divine protection, the favor of the gods, and the wild, martial character that the Romans saw in themselves. The twins didn't remain with the wolf forever. A shepherd named Faustulus, who kept his flocks on the slopes of the Palatine Hill, discovered the children with their unusual nursemaid. Recognizing that something extraordinary was happening, he took the boys home to his wife, Iaca Laurentia. The couple raised Romulus and Remus as their own sons, never telling them of their royal birth or divine paternity. The boys grew into strong, courageous young men. They became leaders among the local shepherds, organizing them for protection against bandits and wild animals. They had a natural authority, a charisma that drew others to follow them. They were always at the forefront in any conflict, whether defending their flocks from rustlers or settling disputes between neighboring communities. Eventually, their identity was revealed. The exact circumstances differ between various versions of the story. In some accounts, Remus was captured during a raid and brought before Numitor, the deposed king, for judgment. Numitor, seeing something familiar in the young man, began to suspect who he might be. In other versions, Faustulus finally told the twins the truth about how he had found them. However the revelation occurred, Romulus and Remus learned that they were not the sons of a shepherd, but the grandsons of the rightful king of Alba Longa, descendants of Aeneas and Venus, and most likely the sons of Mars himself. Armed with this knowledge, the twins took action. They gathered a force of loyal shepherds and marched on Alba Longa. They overthrew Amulius, killing the usurper who had stolen the throne and tried to murder them as infants. They freed their mother from imprisonment and restored their grandfather Numitor to power. Alba Longa celebrated the return of its rightful king. But Romulus and Remus didn't stay in Alba Longa. They were young men full of ambition, eager to make their own mark on the world. Rather than wait to inherit a throne, they decided to found a new city at the place where they had been abandoned and saved, at the base of the Palatine Hill. Numitor blessed their venture and may have even provided them with settlers, criminals, outlaws, and other undesirables from Alba Longa, who would form the first population of the new city. The twins set out with their followers to establish this new settlement. But a problem immediately arose. Who would be the king? They were twins, neither older than the other. Both had equal claim to leadership. They couldn't rule jointly because Roman tradition held that there could be only one king. They needed a way to decide which of them would hold supreme power. They turned to augury, the practice of reading the will of the gods through the observation of birds, a technique the Romans had learned from the Etruscans. Remus climbed to the top of the Aventine Hill, while Romulus took his position on the Palatine Hill. They watched the sky, waiting for a sign. Remus saw 6 vultures flying overhead. But then Romulus saw 12 vultures. The gods had spoken. Romulus would be king. Not everyone was satisfied with this result. Remus disputed the outcome, claiming he had seen his sign first. Arguments broke out among the followers of each brother. To make his claim concrete, Romulus began marking out the sacred boundary of his new city on the Palatine Hill, ordering his men to dig a ditch and build a wall around the perimeter. This boundary was sacred, inviolable. To cross it without permission was an offense against the gods. What happened next remains one of the most controversial and debated elements of Roman mythology. In the most common versions of the story, Remus, angry at being passed over for kingship, mocked his brother's efforts. To demonstrate his contempt for Romulus's pretensions, Remus jumped over the newly built wall. In a rage, Romulus killed his brother. According to some accounts, Romulus himself struck the fatal blow, crying out, "So perish anyone who crosses my walls." Other versions claim that one of Romulus's followers, a man named Scylla, killed Remus while Romulus watched. The fratricide is deeply troubling, and ancient Roman writers were clearly uncomfortable with it. How could their city, their great civilization, begin with such an act? The historian Livy presents multiple versions of Remus's death, noting that some sources say it was Scylla who killed him, not Romulus, or that Remus died in a general brawl rather than by his brother's hand. Some later writers tried to sanitize the story entirely, suggesting that Remus survived and peacefully withdrew from power, but the fratricide was too deeply embedded in Roman tradition to be entirely erased. And perhaps, in a dark way, it reflected something Romans recognized in their own history. Their city would be built on ambition, on the willingness to do whatever was necessary for power, on the priority of the state over personal bonds. The story of Romulus killing Remus to found Rome was a kind of original sin, establishing a pattern that would repeat throughout Roman history in the civil wars, political assassinations, and power struggles that would rack the Republic and Empire. With Remus dead and buried, Romulus continued building his city. He marked out the Pomerium, the sacred boundary, performing the rituals that would consecrate the space. He gave the city his name, Roma, or Rome. Romans in later periods loved to debate whether the name actually came from Romulus or whether Romulus's name had been derived from an earlier name for the settlement. He established the first institutions of government, creating the Senate to advise him, dividing the population into 3 tribes, and organizing the army. But a new city needs more than institutions. It needs people. And Romulus faced a demographic problem. Most of his followers were men. Outlaws, exiles, runaway slaves, criminals fleeing justice elsewhere. These were hardy and useful for establishing a new settlement, but they couldn't build a lasting city without women, without families, without the to reproduce and grow. The neighboring Sabine tribes refused to allow their daughters to marry the Romans, viewing them as a band of brigands unworthy of alliance. Romulus devised a plan. He announced a great festival in honor of Neptune, inviting all the neighboring peoples to attend. When the Sabines came with their families to witness the games and celebrations, Roman men, at a prearranged signal, rushed into the crowd and seized the Sabine women, carrying them off by force. This event, known as the rape of the Sabine women, has been depicted by countless artists throughout history. Though the word rape in this context means abduction rather than necessarily sexual assault. The Romans claimed they intended to marry these women honorably, but the Sabines were understandably outraged. War seemed inevitable. The conflict that followed was fierce. The Sabines, led by their king Titus Tatius, attacked Rome. They managed to infiltrate the city through treachery when the daughter of a Roman commander opened a gate for them in exchange for what she thought would be golden bracelets. The Romans soon discovered that not all the Sabine women were eager to be rescued. Many had come to love their Roman husbands and were pregnant with their children. These women didn't want to see their fathers and brothers fighting their husbands. According to legend, as the 2 armies met in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, the very spot where the Roman Forum would be established, the Sabine women rushed between the battle lines. With babies in their arms, they pleaded with both sides to end the bloodshed. Their fathers and brothers couldn't bear to continue fighting when it meant potentially harming their daughters and grandsons. The Romans were moved by their wives' pleas. A peace was brokered. More than just a peace, actually, a merger. The Romans and Sabines agreed to unite into a single people. Romulus and Titus Tatius would rule jointly as co-kings, The Sabines would live on the Capitoline Hill and the surrounding area, while the Romans remained on the Palatine. The two peoples would share the valley between them, which would become the Forum, the common meeting place. Citizens from both groups would have equal rights and privileges. This joint kingship lasted several years, though Titus Tatius was eventually killed, leaving Romulus as sole ruler once again. The story of the Sabine women, like the fratricide, reflects deep themes in how Romans understood themselves. They were a mixed people, drawing strength from diverse origins. They were pragmatic, willing to use force when necessary, but also capable of accommodation and integration. And they were committed to the idea of Rome as something larger than tribal identity, a political community based on citizenship rather than pure ethnicity. Romulus's reign continued for many years. He gave Rome its first laws, its military organization, its social structure. He waged wars against neighboring cities, expanding Roman territory. He disappeared mysteriously during a thunderstorm while reviewing his troops on the Campus Martius. Some said he had been assassinated by envious senators. Others claimed he had been taken up to heaven by his father Mars, transformed into the god Quirinus. The Romans built a temple to Quirinus on the Quirinal Hill, and Romulus was worshipped as a deity. The traditional date given for the founding of Rome was the 21st of April, 753 years before the Common Era. This date, calculated by the Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro in the 1st century before the Common Era, was celebrated as Rome's birthday and marked the beginning of the Roman calendar. It also happened to coincide with the Perilia, an ancient festival in honor of Pallas, the deity of shepherds, which seemed fitting given that Romulus had been raised by a shepherd. This, then, was the foundation myth as the Romans knew it. A story of exile and wandering, divine parentage and miraculous survival, fratricide and forcible marriage, war and reconciliation. It gave Rome an ancient pedigree, connecting it to the heroic age of Greek mythology through Aeneas, while also asserting a unique Latin identity through Romulus. It explained the city's mixed population and provided divine sanction for its imperial ambitions. The gods themselves had decreed that Rome would rule the world. But what does the archaeological evidence tell us? How much, if any, of this magnificent story is historical? To answer these questions, we need to examine what has been discovered beneath the streets and buildings of Rome over the past 2 centuries of excavation. Archaeological reality, what the earth reveals. When archaeologists began systematically excavating Rome in the 19th and 20th centuries, they approached the foundation myths with healthy skepticism. Ancient legends, however beautiful and meaningful, are not reliable historical sources. They are created long after the events they purport to describe, shaped by political agendas, religious beliefs, and narrative conventions. If we want to know what really happened in 8th century Latium, we need physical evidence. That evidence has proven to be both frustratingly incomplete and surprisingly suggestive. Rome has been continuously inhabited for nearly 3,000 years. Each generation has built on top of what came before, destroying older structures, filling in foundations, scattering artifacts, and generally making life difficult for archaeologists. The ancient city lies buried under meters of debris and centuries of construction. Large-scale excavation is limited by the presence of modern buildings, underground utilities, and political sensitivities. You can't just tear up a living city to explore its past. Nevertheless, patient and painstaking archaeological work has revealed a great deal about early Rome. The picture that emerges is complex. challenging some aspects of the traditional narrative while surprisingly confirming others, and ultimately suggesting that the myths, while not historically accurate in their details, may preserve genuine memories of real events. The Palatine Hill has been the focus of intensive investigation. This makes sense, as the myth identifies it as the original site of Romulus's settlement. Excavations here have uncovered the foundations of huts dating to the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era. These are simple structures, circular or oval in plan, with post holes indicating where wooden posts supported thatched roofs. The walls would have been made of wattle and daub, woven branches covered with mud and straw. The floors were packed earth. These huts match the style of dwelling typical for Iron Age glacial culture. They're consistent with settlements found elsewhere in Latium from the same period. Significantly, they're also consistent with the shapes of certain hut urns found in early Latin burials, suggesting that the urns were modeled on actual houses. The Romans may have been preserving a tradition when they maintained a structure called the Casa Romuli, the hut of Romulus, on the Palatine Hill well into historical times. This was likely not the actual dwelling of an 8th century founder, but rather a reconstruction or preserved example of an ancient hut-style building that helped Romans visualize their origins. The dating of these Palatine structures is crucial and contentious. Archaeological methods, particularly radiocarbon dating and analysis of pottery styles, place the earliest permanent habitation on the Palatine to roughly 900 to 800 years before the Common Era. This is a full century or more before the traditional founding date of 753. However, the transformation from scattered hut settlements to something resembling an organized community appears to accelerate in the mid-8th century, perhaps around 770 to 750. So while the Palatine was occupied earlier than tradition claims, the traditional date for Rome's founding might actually correspond to a moment when these separate hilltop villages began coalescing into a single political entity. Excavations in the Forum Valley have revealed a complex sequence of development. In the earliest period, 10th to 9th centuries, this area was marshy and prone to flooding. It served as a burial ground for the communities living on the surrounding hills. Cremation burials, with ashes placed in urns, and inhumation burials, with bodies laid in graves, have both been found here. The presence of different burial practices in close proximity has led to debate among archaeologists about whether they represent different ethnic groups or simply changing customs over time. The key transformation of the Forum area occurred in the 7th and 6th centuries. The valley was systematically drained through the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, a massive sewer system that channeled water into the Tiber River. This was an enormous engineering undertaking, requiring substantial organization and labor. Once drained, the Forum could be paved and built upon. The earliest structures dating to the Archaic period include the Regia, a building associated with early Roman kings, and the Temple of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. These foundations, made of tufa stone, show a level of architectural sophistication that indicates increasing urbanization. Recent excavations have pushed some evidence back even earlier. In 2009, archaeologists discovered a defensive wall near the Lapis Niger, a black marble shrine in the Forum traditionally associated with Romulus's tomb. The wall was made of tufa blocks and included a channel for diverting water. Pottery and organic materials found near the wall allowed it to be dated to the 9th century before the Common Era, with some evidence possibly suggesting it could be even older. This wall is older than the traditional founding date of Rome by at least a century. What does this mean? Some archaeologists argue that it proves there was significant organized activity, perhaps even an urban settlement on the site of Rome well before 753. Others point out that a single wall doesn't make a city, and that the traditional founding date might refer not to first habitation, but to some specific political act. Perhaps the formal establishment of a unified community from previously separate villages. One of the most controversial figures in this archaeological debate is Andrea Carandini, a distinguished Italian archaeologist who has worked extensively on the Palatine Hill. Carandini has made claims that many of his colleagues find excessive. He asserts that he has found evidence of an 8th century wall on the Palatine that corresponds to the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, marked out by Romulus. He claims to have identified the remains of a royal palace from the regal period. Most provocatively, he argues that Romulus was a real historical figure, and that the traditional foundation myth preserves genuine historical memories, not mere legend. Most archaeologists reject Carandini's interpretations as overreaching. They argue that he is too eager to find confirmation of the myths in ambiguous archaeological remains, that his dating methods are questionable, and that he interprets structures in ways that fit the legends rather than letting the evidence speak for itself. The archaeological establishment generally maintains that while settlements certainly existed on the site of Rome in the 8th century, there's no evidence for a single founder or a specific founding act. And the name Romulus is almost certainly a back formation from the name Rome rather than vice versa. But Carandini has defenders too. They point out that archaeology has confirmed many aspects of ancient tradition that were once dismissed as pure myth. The city of Troy, long thought to be entirely legendary, was discovered and excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the late 19th century. Homer's Iliad turned out to have some basis in historical Bronze Age conflicts. Could the same be true for the Roman foundation story? The debate is not simply academic. It touches on deeper questions about how we understand the relationship between myth and history, between collective memory and archaeological evidence, between what ancient peoples believed about themselves and what modern science can demonstrate. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Not that Romulus was a real person who did exactly what the legends claim, but that the myths preserve distorted memories of real events, real conflicts, real social transformations that occurred during Rome's formative period. What we can say with confidence is that by the late 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, the separate settlements on Rome's hills were beginning to merge into something resembling a unified community. The Forum was being developed as a common space. Defensive works were being constructed. A more complex social hierarchy was emerging, with elite families establishing prominence. Religious sanctuaries were being formalized, creating shared sacred spaces that bound the community together. Trade was increasing, bringing prosperity and outside influences. This process of urbanization was not unique to Rome. Similar transformations were occurring throughout central Italy during this period, influenced by the Etruscan civilization to the north and by Greek colonies in southern Italy. The Etruscans, in particular, were developing impressive cities with sophisticated architecture, engineering, and social organization. The Latins, including the Romans, were absorbing these influences while maintaining their own distinct identity. And this brings us to one of the most important factors in Rome's early development, one that dramatically shaped the city's trajectory and left an indelible mark on its culture: the Etruscan influence, and particularly the domination of Rome by Etruscan kings during much of the 6th century. This period, while often overshadowed in popular imagination by the more famous story of Romulus and Remus, was perhaps even more crucial in transforming Rome from a collection of villages into a genuine city-state capable of future greatness, the Seven Hills, an early settlement. Before we explore the Etruscan period, we need to understand the physical geography of early Rome and how its unique topography shaped the city's development. Rome is famously built on 7 hills, though the exact identity of these 7 has varied over time, and the actual number of hills in the area is greater than 7. The canonical list includes the Palatine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, Caelian, and Aventine hills. Each of these elevated areas played a specific role in Rome's early history. The Palatine Hill, as we've discussed, holds pride of place as the legendary site of Romulus's original settlement and the location of the earliest archaeological evidence of permanent habitation. Rising about 50 meters above the surrounding plain, it offered excellent views and natural defensive advantages. Its slopes were steep enough to deter easy assault, but gentle enough to climb. In later periods, the Palatine would become Rome's most prestigious residential area, eventually home to the palaces of emperors. Indeed, the very word palace derives from Palatine. The Capitoline Hill lies northwest of the Palatine, across the valley that would become the Forum. Actually composed of 2 summits, the Capitolium and the Arx, it was even more defensible than the Palatine due to its steep cliffs. In ancient times, the Capitoline was Rome's religious center, home to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the supreme god, along with Juno and Minerva. This temple, which would be reconstructed multiple times over the centuries, symbolized Roman power and was the destination of triumphal processions celebrating military victories. The Quirinal Hill extends northeast from the Capitoline. Archaeological evidence suggests it was occupied by a community culturally similar, but perhaps ethnically distinct from the Palatine settlers. Some scholars have speculated that the Quirinal residents might have been Sabines, which would lend credence to the legend of the Sabine integration into Rome. The god Quirinus, with whom the deified Romulus was identified, had his temple on this hill. The Viminal Hill, the smallest of the 7, lies between the Quirinal and Esquiline. It may have been inhabited somewhat later than the other hills, as archaeological remains here are generally from the later Archaic period, rather than the early Iron Age. The Esquiline Hill, extending to the east, was long used as a burial ground before being incorporated into the city proper. Its necropolis has provided archaeologists with invaluable artifacts, including pottery, grave goods, and the remains of different burial practices that help us understand the cultural mix of early Rome. The Caelian Hill, south of the Esquiline and east of the Palatine, may have been brought into the Roman community through military conquest. Tradition held that King Tullus Hostilius, one of the early kings, destroyed the city of Alba Longa and resettled its inhabitants on the Caelian Hill. Whether this specific story is true or not, the archaeological evidence suggests that the Caelian was incorporated into Rome later than some of the other hills, possibly through absorption of a previously independent settlement. Finally, the Aventine Hill rises south of the Palatine, separated from it by a low valley. The Aventine has always had an interesting status in Rome's topography and social history. It was technically outside the sacred Pomerium, the city's ritual boundary, until the Emperor Claudius extended it in the 1st century of the Common Era. In the early and Middle Republic, the Aventine was associated with the plebeians, the common people, as opposed to the patricians who dominated the Palatine and Capitoline. It was here that the plebeians would gather when they withdrew from the city during their struggles for political rights. Between these hills lay the valleys, and particularly the valley that would become the Forum Romanum. In the earliest period, as we've noted, this was marshy and flood-prone, fed by streams flowing down from the surrounding hills and by the overflow of the Tiber River during wet seasons. It was unsuitable for habitation, but was used for agriculture and, more significantly, as a meeting ground between the communities on different hills. Think about what this geography meant for early Rome's development. You had multiple independent settlements, each on a defensible hilltop, separated by valleys, but within easy communication distance. They could see each other's smoke rising from cooking fires. They could hear sounds carrying across the valleys. When threats appeared, when foreign peoples or animals approached, warning signals could be passed from hill to hill. Yet each community maintained its autonomy, its own leadership, its own identity. The process of unification must have been gradual. Perhaps it began with informal cooperation, communities coming together for mutual defense or to celebrate shared religious festivals. Trade relationships would have developed. Intermarriage between families from different hills would have created kinship bonds crossing community boundaries. Shared language and culture, the common Latin heritage, provided a foundation for closer integration. At some point, probably in the 8th or early 7th century, the decision was made, or the need became apparent, to create formal political unity. This might have been driven by external threats. The Etruscans to the north were powerful and expanding. Other Latin communities might have posed challenges. Internal conflicts between the hilltop communities might have necessitated a mechanism for resolving disputes and maintaining order. Or perhaps it was simply the logic of economic and military efficiency. A unified Rome would be stronger, wealthier, and more secure than isolated hilltop villages. Creating this unity required both practical measures and symbolic ones. The practical measures included draining the Forum Valley so it could serve as a genuine common space rather than a swamp. This was achieved through the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, that remarkable drainage system that was one of Rome's earliest major engineering projects. Tradition attributes its construction to the Etruscan king Tarquinius Priscus, though it was likely begun earlier and expanded over time. Once drained, the Forum could be paved and built upon. Shops and markets could be established, providing economic activity that would draw people from all the surrounding communities. Political institutions could be housed in permanent structures rather than temporary meeting places. Religious shrines could be built that would serve as focal points for communal worship, creating shared rituals that reinforced the sense of common identity. The symbolic measures were equally important. The very name Roma, Rome, served to supersede the individual identities of the various hilltop settlements. Citizens would increasingly identify themselves as Romans, rather than primarily as Palatine dwellers or Quirinal dwellers, though local identities and rivalries certainly persisted. The Senate, the Council of Elders drawn from prominent families of all the communities, provided a mechanism for the different groups to have a voice in governance while acknowledging the supreme authority of the king. The ritual definition of the pomerium, the sacred boundary, was perhaps the most important symbolic act. By marking out a boundary that encompassed all the hills, or at least the central core, the king asserted that what lay within was a single sacred space, a unified community under divine protection. Crossing this boundary had legal and religious significance. Inside the pomerium, certain rules applied. Outside it, different rules held sway. Military forces, for instance, were not permitted to operate within the pomerium under most circumstances, reinforcing the distinction between civil and military authority. Water supply was another crucial factor. The hills had their own springs and sources of fresh water. But as population grew, these became insufficient. The Romans began constructing aqueducts to bring water from distant sources. The first of these, the Aqua Appia, wasn't built until the early Republic, but the need for reliable water supply was recognized much earlier. Control of water sources and the ability to distribute water equitably among the different communities was a significant aspect of governance. The strategic importance of Rome's location cannot be overstated. The Tiber River was navigable for seagoing ships up to Rome, making the city an inland port with access to Mediterranean trade. But the river was also fordable at Rome, particularly near the Tiber Island, making it a natural crossing point for overland routes. Anyone traveling between Etruria to the north and the Greek colonies of Campania to the south would likely pass through or near Rome. The famous salt road, the Via Salaria, brought valuable salt from the coastal marshes inland through Rome, providing another source of trade and wealth. This combination of defensible hilltop positions, access to water and trade, fertile surrounding farmland, and a central location in Latium made Rome's site nearly ideal for developing into a major city. But location alone doesn't create greatness. Human agency, political organization, cultural development, military success, all these played crucial roles. And in Rome's early development, a significant role was played by a foreign people whose influence would permanently shape Roman culture, the Etruscans. The Etruscan influence. To understand the Etruscans and their impact on Rome, we first need to understand who they were, which is not as simple as it might seem. The Etruscans remain one of the most mysterious peoples of ancient Italy, despite the wealth of archaeological material they left behind. Their origins have been debated since ancient times, with various theories proposing that they were indigenous to Italy, migrants from Anatolia, or descended from Aegean peoples. Ancient Greek and Roman authors were fascinated by the Etruscans. The 5th century Greek historian Herodotus claimed they had migrated from Lydia in Asia Minor during a time of famine. Other ancient sources disputed this, arguing that they were native Italians. Modern genetic and linguistic studies have provided some clarity. The Etruscans appear to have been primarily indigenous to Italy, developing their distinctive culture locally during the Iron Age. Though they certainly had extensive contacts with the Eastern Mediterranean world that influenced their art, religion, and customs. What we do know is that by the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, the Etruscan civilization was flourishing in the region the Romans called Tuscia or Etruria, modern-day Tuscany, and parts of Lazio and Umbria. They were organized into a confederation of 12 major city-states, each independent but sharing a common culture, language, and religious traditions. These cities included Veii, Caere, Tarquinia, Vulci, Volsini, and others. Each was ruled by a lucumo, a king or warlord, though some cities eventually transitioned to republican forms of government. Etruscan society was sophisticated and wealthy, representing one of the most advanced civilizations in Iron Age Italy. They were master metallurgists, mining and working iron, copper, silver, and gold from the rich mineral deposits of their homeland. The metal wealth of Etruria formed the foundation of their economic power, enabling extensive trade networks that connected them to Phoenician merchants, Greek colonists, and even distant Carthage. Etruscan metalwork was prized throughout the Mediterranean world, with their bronze sculptures, jewelry, and decorated weapons commanding high prices in foreign markets. Their artwork, particularly their pottery and tomb paintings, shows remarkable skill and aesthetic sense that distinguished Etruscan culture from its neighbors. The tomb paintings, preserved in underground burial chambers cut from soft tufa rock, depict scenes of banqueting, dancing, athletic competitions, and daily life with vibrant colors and dynamic compositions. These paintings provide invaluable insights into Etruscan society, revealing a culture that valued pleasure, celebration, and the enjoyment of life's luxuries. The famous Tomb of the Leopards at Tarquinia, the Tomb of the Triclinium, and countless others showcase an artistic tradition that would influence Roman art for centuries. Etruscan pottery evolved through several distinct styles. In the early period, they produced impasto ware, coarse pottery for everyday use. As their civilization matured and trade contacts expanded, they began producing bucchero, a distinctive black pottery with a metallic sheen achieved through a reduction firing technique. Later, influenced by Greek imports, Etruscan potters created red figure and black figure pottery that rivaled Greek craftsmanship. They also excelled in terracotta sculpture, producing elaborate sarcophagi adorned with reclining figures of the deceased. Often depicted as married couples lounging together in poses, suggesting marital equality unusual for the ancient Mediterranean world. They built impressive cities with stone walls, paved streets, and complex drainage systems that demonstrated advanced urban planning and engineering capabilities. Cities like Veii, Tarquinia, Caere, and Vulci were laid out on grid patterns, with clearly defined spaces for temples, public buildings, residential areas, and necropolises. The city walls, constructed of massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar, were formidable defensive structures that could withstand prolonged sieges. Within the cities, paved streets facilitated commerce and movement, while sophisticated drainage and sewage systems prevented the accumulation of waste and standing water that could breed disease. Etruscan architecture was characterized by the use of the arch, a structural innovation they may have learned from Greek contacts or developed independently. The true arch, with its wedge-shaped voussoirs supporting each other through compression, allowed the Etruscans to build strong, durable structures capable of spanning wide spaces. This technology, which the Romans would later adopt and perfect, enabled the construction of monumental gateways, bridges, and interior spaces. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Rome, built under Etruscan direction, showcased this architectural sophistication on a grand scale. Their religious practices, particularly their divination techniques and their belief in an afterlife, would deeply influence Roman religion in ways that persisted for centuries. The Etruscans were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill in interpreting the will of the gods through various forms of divination. Haruspicy, the practice of examining the livers of sacrificed animals to read divine messages, was an Etruscan specialty that Romans adopted wholesale. Etruscan haruspices, religious specialists trained in this art, were consulted by Roman generals, politicians, and even emperors well into the imperial period. The Etruscan practice of taking auspices through observing the flight patterns of birds also became central to Roman religious and political life, with no major public action taken without first consulting the auspices. The Etruscan conception of the afterlife was complex and in some ways rather gloomy compared to Greek or Roman beliefs. They believed that the dead continued to exist in an underworld realm where they maintained something of their earthly status and relationships. The elaborate tomb architecture and rich grave goods placed with the dead reflect this belief in continued existence beyond death. Tomb paintings sometimes depict demons and frightening supernatural beings awaiting the deceased, suggesting an afterlife that was not entirely pleasant. This darker vision of death may have influenced certain aspects of Roman attitudes toward mortality and the underworld. The Etruscans were also formidable warriors and ambitious expansionists. At their height, Etruscan influence extended from the Po Valley in the north down into Campania in the south, making them one of the dominant powers of Iron Age Italy. They clashed with Greek colonists over control of trade routes and with other Italic peoples over territory. Their extensive trade networks connected them to the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and Greeks, bringing foreign goods, ideas, and artistic styles to Italy. Rome, located on the southern frontier of Etruscan territory, could not avoid involvement with this powerful neighbor. Initially, relations may have been primarily commercial. Etruscan merchants would have passed through Rome, perhaps establishing trading posts. Etruscan craftsmen might have been hired for their expertise. Cultural exchange would have occurred naturally as people from both societies interacted. But at some point, probably in the late 7th century before the Common Era, this relationship changed dramatically. Rome came under Etruscan political control. Exactly how this happened remains unclear. It might have been military conquest, with an Etruscan army seizing the city. It might have been political maneuvering, with an Etruscan nobleman marrying into the Roman elite and eventually seizing power. Or it might have been something more gradual and complex, with Etruscan influence increasing over time until it resulted in Etruscan kings ruling Rome. Roman tradition preserved the names and stories of 3 Etruscan kings who ruled Rome: Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, called Tarquin the Elder, Servius Tullius, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, called Tarquin the Proud. According to tradition, these kings ruled during much of the 6th century before the Common Era, though the specific dates assigned to their reigns should be treated with caution. The first Etruscan king, Tarquinius Priscus, was said to be the son of a Greek merchant who had fled to Etruria and married an Etruscan woman. Unable to achieve political prominence in Etruria due to his Greek heritage, he moved to Rome, where he quickly rose to power through his wealth, intelligence, and political skill. According to legend, an eagle snatched his cap as he entered Rome and then returned it to his head, which his wife, skilled in Etruscan divination, interpreted as a sign that he would achieve great power. Whether or not Tarquinius Priscus was a real historical figure, the tradition associated with him reflects real historical processes. His reign supposedly saw dramatic expansion of Roman territory and the beginning of major urban development. He drained parts of the Forum Valley, began the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, and laid foundations for the great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. He enlarged the Senate and reformed the military. He introduced Etruscan religious practices and ceremonies to Rome. Tarquinius Priscus was supposedly succeeded by Servius Tullius, who had an unusual background. Various traditions claimed he was the son of a slave woman, though other accounts suggested he was actually a Latin or Etruscan nobleman who had been captured as a child. Servius Tullius was remembered as one of Rome's greatest reformers. Tradition credits him with conducting a census of the Roman population and organizing citizens into classes based on wealth rather than birth. Reforms that would have profound implications for both military organization and political participation. The reforms attributed to Servius Tullius included the creation of the Comitia Centuriata, an assembly organized by military units called centuries, which would become one of Rome's primary political bodies. Servius Tullius was also credited with extending Rome's boundaries, incorporating additional hills into the city, and constructing a defensive circuit. While later Romans called these fortifications the Servian Wall, the walls that survived into later periods and can still be seen today were built or rebuilt after the Gallic sack of Rome in the early 4th century, making their connection to the 6th century king uncertain. The last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, was remembered very differently if Servius Tullius was the good king. Tarquinius Superbus was the tyrant. He was said to have seized power by murdering Servius Tullius, his father-in-law, with the connivance of Servius's own daughter Tullia, who was Tarquinius's wife. He ruled as a despot, dispensing with the Senate's advice, executing potential rivals, and enriching himself at the expense of his subjects. Yet even Tarquinius Superbus was credited with significant achievements. He completed the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, creating one of ancient Italy's most impressive religious structures. He extended Roman power over the Latin League, forcing other Latin cities to acknowledge Roman supremacy. He may have been a cruel tyrant by the standards later Romans applied, but he was also an effective ruler who increased Rome's power and prestige. What are we to make of these Etruscan kings? How much of their story is history and how much is legend? The scholarly consensus is that while the specific details are questionable, the basic framework is probably accurate. Rome was indeed ruled by Etruscan kings, or by kings heavily influenced by Etruscan culture during much of the 6th century. This is supported by both archaeological evidence and linguistic analysis. The archaeological evidence is compelling. The late Archaic period in Rome, roughly 600 to 500 before the Common Era, shows a dramatic increase in monumental construction, sophisticated engineering, and Etruscan artistic styles. The drainage of the Forum, the construction of major temples, the development of paved streets and public spaces, all these point to a highly organized society with access to advanced engineering knowledge and substantial resources. This level of development is consistent with rule by monarchs who could mobilize labor and materials on a large scale. The artistic evidence is equally striking. Etruscan-style pottery, sculpture, and architectural elements from this period are abundant in Rome. Certain religious practices and institutions show clear Etruscan influence. The very symbols of Roman authority, the fasces carried by lictors and the toga praetexta worn by magistrates, were borrowed from Etruscan tradition. Even the word for person in Latin, persona, may derive from the Etruscan fersu, suggesting deep cultural interchange. Linguistic evidence supports the idea of Etruscan political control. Certain Roman family names, including patrician families who remained prominent for centuries, show clear Etruscan etymologies. Names ending in Anna, Ina, or Erna are typically Etruscan. The fact that these families held high status in later periods suggests they were already established as elites during the regal period, possibly as Etruscan nobles or Romans who had adopted Etruscan culture. What impact did this Etruscan period have on Rome's development? It was profound and lasting. The Etruscans essentially taught the Romans how to build a city. The engineering skills required for drainage systems, for constructing large public buildings, for paving streets, for building defensive walls. All these were Etruscan expertise that Romans absorbed and later perfected. Roman religious practices and concepts of divination owed much to Etruscan influence. The elaborate rituals surrounding augury, the taking of auspices, the consultation of sacred books, all reflected Etruscan traditions. Perhaps most significantly, the Etruscan period gave Rome its fundamental political geography and urban structure. The Forum as the city's center, the Capitoline as its religious heart. The organization of space between public, sacred, and private areas. All these patterns were established during the 6th century under Etruscan influence. When Rome eventually overthrew its Etruscan kings and established the Republic, it retained and built upon these foundations rather than dismantling them. But the Etruscan dominance was not to last. Eventually, Rome would rebel against its foreign overlords and establish a new form of government that would last for nearly 5 centuries. The end of the monarchy and the birth of the Roman Republic is itself a dramatic story. And like the story of Rome's founding, it exists in both legendary and historical versions. The regal period, the 7 kings of Rome. Roman tradition held that Rome was ruled by 7 kings, from Romulus to Tarquinius Superbus, spanning roughly 244 years. Modern historians are skeptical of this tidy narrative. 7 is a symbolically significant number in many cultures, and the idea that Rome happened to have exactly 7 kings, with reigns that conveniently average about 35 years each, seems suspiciously neat. Moreover, the detailed stories about each king read more like moral exemplars than historical accounts. Numa Pompilius was pious and peace-loving. Tullus Hostilius was warlike and aggressive. Ancus Marcius balanced military strength with commercial development, and so on. Each king embodied certain Roman virtues or demonstrated the consequences of certain vices. The historicity of individual kings is doubtful. Yet the general outline of the regal period, a phase of monarchical government before the Republic, is almost certainly historical. Let's briefly review what tradition says about each of the 7 kings, understanding that we're dealing with legend that may preserve some historical kernels, but has been heavily shaped by later Roman ideological concerns. Romulus, as we've discussed, was the founder, establishing Rome's basic institutions, expanding its territory, and setting precedents that later generations would claim to follow. After Romulus's mysterious disappearance or apotheosis, the Romans faced a succession crisis. Rather than immediately choose a new king from among the prominent Roman families, they looked to the Sabines, the people who had been integrated into Rome during Romulus's reign. This choice reflected either genuine desire for balance between the two groups or, more cynically, Roman political maneuvering to prevent any single faction from becoming too powerful. Numa Pompilius, a Sabine, was chosen as the 2nd king. In stark contrast to the warlike Romulus, Numa was remembered as a man of peace and piety. He supposedly ruled for 43 years without engaging in warfare, instead focusing on establishing Rome's religious institutions. He created the priesthoods, codified religious rituals, built temples, and reformed the calendar, introducing a lunar calendar that attempted to align with the solar year. The Romans attributed many of their most ancient religious practices to Numa's wisdom. The historical Numa, if he existed, probably did not accomplish all that later tradition claimed. Instead, he likely served as a convenient figure onto whom Romans could project the origins of various religious traditions whose actual origins were forgotten. The Romans needed to explain where their elaborate religious system came from, and attributing it to a wise, ancient king was more satisfying than admitting that practices had evolved gradually or been borrowed from neighbors. After Numa's peaceful reign came Tullus Hostilius, supposedly the complete opposite of his predecessor. Where Numa avoided war, Tullus actively sought it. His name literally means hostile, which seems almost too perfect to be coincidental. Tullus's major accomplishment, according to tradition, was the destruction of Alba Longa, Rome's mother city. After a war between Rome and Alba Longa was decided by combat between two sets of triplet brothers, the Horatii fighting for Rome and the Curiati for Alba. Tullus accused the Albans of treachery and razed their city to the ground, resettling the population in Rome on the Caelian Hill. This story, with its details of the triple combat and the treacherous Alban dictator, reads like epic poetry rather than history. Yet archaeological evidence does suggest that settlements in the Alban Hills were abandoned during the Archaic period, and their populations may have been absorbed into Rome or other cities. If so, Tullus Hostilius might represent a genuine memory of Roman military expansion and the violent consolidation of power in Latium. The fourth king was Ancus Marcius, supposedly the grandson of Numa Pompilius, and thus another Sabine connection. Ancus was credited with military victories over the Latins, but also with commercial and civic achievements. He supposedly founded Rome's port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, built the first bridge across the Tiber, and expanded the city's territory to include the Aventine Hill. He was also said to have established a prison in Rome and created certain legal procedures. Again, these attributed achievements are suspiciously comprehensive, covering multiple different aspects of Roman development. It's more plausible that Ancus Marcius serves as a legendary placeholder for various developments that occurred during the Middle Regal period, perhaps spanning several generations and multiple rulers whose individual identities were lost or conflated. The last three kings, the Etruscans, we've already discussed. Tarquinius Priscus brought Etruscan culture and engineering to Rome. Servius Tullius reformed Roman society and expanded its territory. Tarquinius Superbus completed major building projects, but earned the hatred of his subjects through tyrannical behavior. Together, these three kings supposedly ruled for about a century, transforming Rome from a large town into a genuine city-state. One interesting aspect of the regal succession is how the kingship was supposedly transferred. Rome's monarchy was not strictly hereditary in the way that many later European monarchies would be. Sons did not automatically succeed fathers. Instead, the Senate and people supposedly had a role in choosing each new king, though the choices were often influenced by family connections, wealth, and political power. This elective quality to the monarchy, if it's historical, helps explain how Rome could come under Etruscan control. If the Romans traditionally had some voice in selecting their kings, then an Etruscan candidate could theoretically be elected if he had enough support, perhaps through wealth, military power, or promises of benefits to influential families. The transition to Etruscan rule need not have been purely the result of military conquest, though force may have played a role. The powers and functions attributed to the Roman kings include military command, judicial authority, religious duties, and legislative initiative. The king was the supreme military commander, leading armies in war and responsible for defending the city. He served as final judge in legal disputes and had the power of life and death over citizens. He performed certain religious rituals and auspices on behalf of the community. He could propose laws to the assembly of citizens, though their approval was required. These royal powers were symbolized by various insignia: the golden crown, the ivory scepter, the purple-bordered toga, and most famously, the fasces. The fasces were bundles of wooden rods bound together around an axe, carried by attendants called lictors who accompanied the king. They symbolized the king's power to punish, with the rods representing corporal punishment and the axe representing the death penalty. Later, during the Republic, the fasces would be carried before consuls and other magistrates, maintaining this symbol of authority even after the monarchy ended. The Senate during the regal period was an advisory council of elders, heads of the most prominent families. The king was expected to consult the Senate on important matters, though he was not strictly bound by its advice. The Senate had one crucial power, however, the interregnum. When a king died, the Senate chose one of its members to serve as interrex, ruling for 5 days until a new king could be selected. This gave the Senate some check on royal power and ensured continuity of government. The popular assemblies, the comitia, also existed during the regal period, though their exact composition and powers are debated. The comitia curiata, based on the ancient curiae or wards of the city, supposedly ratified the selection of kings and approved certain legal acts. Under Servius Tullius, the comitia centuriata was created, organized by military units and wealth classes, which would become more important during the Republic. The regal period, then, whether we accept the traditional 7 kings as historical individuals or view them as legendary figures embodying different phases of Roman development, was a time of fundamental institution building. The basic structures of Roman society, government, military organization, and religion were established. Rome expanded its territory, absorbed neighboring populations, and emerged as a significant power in Latium. Most importantly, Rome developed a civic identity, a sense of itself as a distinct political community with its own traditions and destiny. But monarchy as a form of government would not last. The tyranny of Tarquinius Superbus, or perhaps simply the Romans' growing confidence in their own ability to govern themselves, led to a revolution that would forever change Rome's political trajectory from monarchy to republic. The traditional date for the overthrow of the Roman monarchy and the establishment of the Republic is 509 years before the Common Era. As with the founding date of 753, this should be treated as approximate and symbolic rather than precisely accurate. What matters is that sometime in the late 6th or early 5th century, Rome transitioned from monarchical to republican government, and this transition had profound consequences for Roman history. The story of how this happened, as preserved in Roman tradition, is dramatic and moralistic. It centers on an act of sexual violence and the outrage it provoked. Sextus Tarquinius, son of King Tarquinius Superbus, was staying at the home of his cousin Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus while the Roman army was besieging the city of Ardea. Collatinus's wife was a woman named Lucretia, renowned for her virtue and beauty. Sextus Tarquinius, inflamed with lust, came to Lucretia's bedroom at night and raped her, threatening to kill her and a slave and claim he had caught them in adultery if she didn't submit. After he left, Lucretia sent for her father and her husband, told them what had happened, made them promise to avenge her, and then stabbed herself to death. She felt that even though she had been forced, her honor was irreparably stained, and death was preferable to living with the shame. Lucretia's death ignited a revolution. Her father, Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, and her husband, along with Lucius Junius Brutus, a nephew of the king who had been pretending to be simple-minded to avoid being murdered by the paranoid Tarquinius, displayed Lucretia's body in the forum and rallied the Roman people against the monarchy. Brutus gave a stirring speech cataloging the crimes and tyrannies of Tarquinius Superbus and his family, and called for the king's expulsion. The Roman people, already resentful of Tarquinius Superbus's harsh rule, were moved by Brutus's words and by Lucretia's tragic fate. they revolted, closing the city gates against the king and his followers. Tarquinius Superbus, who was with the army at Ardea when these events occurred, rushed back to Rome but found himself locked out of his own city. The monarchy was over. Rome would never again be ruled by a king. In place of the king, the Romans established two elected magistrates called consuls. These consuls would share the executive power that had belonged to the king, each serving for 1 year and each having the power to veto the other's actions. Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, Lucretia's widower, became the first consuls. Brutus administered an oath before the assembled people that they would never again tolerate a king in Rome. However, Collatinus's shared name with the hated Tarquin family made him unpopular, and he was soon forced to resign and go into exile, being replaced by Publius Valerius Poplicola, meaning the people's friend. Meanwhile, Tarquinius Superbus sought help from various Etruscan cities to restore him to power. A plot was discovered within Rome itself, involving some young noblemen, including Brutus's own sons, who conspired to restore the monarchy. Brutus, putting the state above personal feeling, condemned his own sons to death and watched as they were executed in the Forum. Etruscan armies marched on Rome. Heroic tales are told of Roman defenders, including Horatius Cocles, who single-handedly held the Sublician Bridge against the Etruscan army while it was being demolished behind him, and Mucius Scaevola, who attempted to assassinate the Etruscan king Lars Porsena, and when caught, demonstrated Roman courage by burning off his own hand in a brazier, claiming that 300 other young Romans were ready to do the same. These stories, like much of this narrative, have the character of legend rather than sober history. The war against the Etruscans was supposedly concluded with a Roman victory at the Battle of Silva Arsia, though the exact outcome is unclear, and some ancient sources suggest that Lars Porsena may have actually captured Rome for a brief period before being driven back. Brutus died in this battle, fighting the son of Tarquinius Superbus in single combat. Both men killed each other, allowing later Romans to honor Brutus as a martyr for liberty. How much of this narrative is historical? Almost certainly, very little of the specific detail. The story of Lucretia reads like a Greek tragedy, with its themes of honor, rape, suicide, and revenge. Similar stories appear in other cultures' foundation myths for republican governments. The heroic tales of Brutus, Horatius, and Mucius Scaevola have the quality of patriotic legends designed to inspire Roman virtue. Yet beneath the legendary overlay, there are historical realities. Rome did transition from monarchy to some form of collective rule around the turn of the 6th to 5th centuries. Archaeological evidence shows destruction and disruption in Rome during this period, consistent with political upheaval. The royal sanctuary at Santo Mobono was abandoned around 500 years before the Common Era and left in ruins for nearly a century, suggesting that sites associated with kingship became taboo. Etruscan power in central Italy was declining during this period due to military defeats by Greeks and pressure from Celtic tribes in the north, which would have made it easier for Rome to assert independence. The specific form that Roman republican government took, with 2 annually elected consuls sharing executive power and checked by a senate and popular assemblies, was probably not established immediately in 509. More likely, there was a period of experimentation and evolution, perhaps lasting decades, before the classical republican constitution emerged. Some scholars argue that Rome may have been ruled by a single magistrate called a praetor or dictator, before the dual consulship was established. Others suggest that the transition may have occurred later than tradition claims, perhaps in the mid-5th century. What we can say is that by the mid-5th century, Rome definitely had a republican form of government with elected magistrates, a powerful senate, and some form of popular participation in government. This system would endure for nearly 500 years, making Rome one of the longest-lasting republics in history. During this period, Rome would expand from a mid-sized city-state to master of Italy, then the entire Mediterranean world, creating an empire that would encompass millions of people across 3 continents. The end of the monarchy was a defining moment in Roman self-conception. Romans would forever after view kingship with suspicion and hostility. To call someone a rex, a king, was one of the worst insults in Roman political discourse. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in March of 44 before the Common Era, his murderers justified their actions by claiming he was attempting to make himself king. Centuries later, even Roman emperors, who held more power than the ancient kings ever dreamed of, avoided the title rex, preferring princeps or imperator. The story of Lucretia, Brutus, and the fall of the Tarquins became a foundational myth for the Republic, taught to every Roman child and celebrated in art, literature, and public commemoration. It established the principle that tyranny was intolerable, that the Roman people had the right to resist unjust authority, and that personal honor and public virtue sometimes required extraordinary sacrifice. Modern scholarship and ongoing debates. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the founding of Rome exists in a strange twilight zone between myth and history. Modern scholarship has made enormous strides in understanding what actually happened during Rome's formative centuries. But significant questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The fundamental challenge is the nature of our sources. The earliest Roman historians whose works survive, Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, were writing in the late 1st century before the Common Era, more than 700 years after the events they describe. They based their accounts on earlier Roman historians, particularly Quintus Fabius Pictor, who wrote in the late 3rd century, and on oral traditions, poetry, and religious rituals that were believed to preserve ancient memories. But each generation of Romans reshaped these traditions to suit contemporary concerns. The stories were never simply transparent windows into the past. Archaeological evidence provides a check on the literary sources, but archaeology has its own limitations. Material remains can tell us about technology, trade, settlement patterns, and demographic changes. They can provide absolute dates through methods like radiocarbon dating and relative dates through stratigraphy and pottery typology. But archaeology cannot tell us about individuals, about political decisions, about religious beliefs, except insofar as these leave material traces. An archaeologist finding an 8th century wall on the Palatine can date the wall and describe its construction, but cannot definitively say who built it or why. The debate over Andrea Carandini's work exemplifies these difficulties. Carandini has spent decades excavating on the Palatine Hill. He believes he has found the remains of a defensive wall dating to the mid-8th century that may correspond to the sacred boundary marked out in legend. He has identified what he interprets as structures that could be from a royal palace of the regal period. He argues that archaeological evidence supports aspects of the traditional foundation narrative, suggesting that the myths may preserve genuine historical memories. Most archaeologists remain skeptical. They point out that Carandini's interpretations often rest on ambiguous evidence that could be explained in other ways. A line of post holes might be the foundation for a wall, or it might be something else entirely. Layers of earth that Carandini dates to the 8th century might actually be later or earlier. The supposed royal palace might be a wealthy private house or even a temple. Critics accuse Carandini of seeing what he wants to see, of allowing the legends to guide his interpretation of the material, rather than letting the material speak for itself. Yet Carandini has defenders who note that archaeology has repeatedly confirmed aspects of ancient traditions that were once dismissed as pure myth. The site of Troy was discovered in Anatolia, even if the connection between the archaeological site and Homer's epic narrative remains debated. Mycenaean civilization clearly existed as a historical reality, even if we must be cautious about accepting Homer's literary depictions of the Bronze Age world. The palace complex at Knossos on Crete was real, revealing a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that may have inspired later Greek legends about King Minos and his labyrinth. Perhaps Carandini's supporters suggest we should take seriously the possibility that Romulus represents a genuine historical memory, even if the details have been mythologized. Most scholars occupy a middle position. They accept that Rome developed from the merger of hilltop villages during the 8th and 7th centuries. They acknowledge that the site was strategically valuable, and that its development was influenced by both Latin culture and Etruscan power. They recognize that the foundation myths may preserve genuine memories of some historical processes, such as the integration of Sabine peoples, the significance of the Alban Hills region in early Latium, and the period of Etruscan influence. But they insist that specific individuals like Romulus and Remus are legendary creations rather than historical figures, that the precise events narrated in the foundation stories are not factual, and that any attempt to correlate specific archaeological finds with specific mythical narratives is methodologically problematic. This scholarly caution is probably wise, yet it's worth reflecting on what we lose by being too dismissive of tradition. The Romans themselves believed these stories. For more than 1,000 years, Romans defined themselves in relation to these myths. The stories shaped their institutions, their values, their sense of identity and destiny. Even if Romulus never existed, the Romans' belief in Romulus had real historical consequences. The myth was a historical force in its own right. Moreover, oral traditions can sometimes preserve surprising accuracy across many generations, particularly when maintained through ritual practices, poetry, and formal instruction. Indigenous peoples around the world have oral histories that preserve information about events from hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Information that has sometimes been confirmed by other forms of evidence. While we should remain cautious, we perhaps should not be too quick to dismiss the possibility that Roman foundation myths preserve at least distorted reflections of actual historical developments. The question of Rome's ethnic composition during its early period is another area of scholarly debate. Were the Romans purely Latin, or did they incorporate significant Sabine, Etruscan, and other elements from the beginning? The traditional narrative emphasizes this mixed heritage, with the integration of the Sabines under Romulus and Tatius, the incorporation of Albans under Tullus Hostilius, and the rule of Etruscan kings. Linguistic evidence supports ethnic diversity. Many Roman family names have non-Latin etymologies. Religious practices show Etruscan, Greek, and indigenous Italic influences. Some scholars argue that this emphasis on diverse origins was a later Roman invention, designed to justify Rome's aggressive expansion and incorporation of conquered peoples. By claiming that Rome itself had been founded as a mixture of different ethnic groups, Romans could argue that their empire was simply continuing an ancient tradition of integration and assimilation. Other scholars counter that the linguistic and archaeological evidence genuinely supports ethnic diversity in early Rome, and that the traditions reflect real historical memory. The dating of key events remains contentious. Is 753 before the Common Era accurate for Rome's founding? Probably not precisely. But the mid-8th century does seem to be when the Palatine and other hills saw a dramatic increase in organized activity and when the process of urbanization accelerated. Is 509 accurate for the establishment of the Republic? Again, probably not precisely, but the transition from monarchy to some form of collective government does seem to have occurred around the turn of the 6th to 5th centuries. The role of women in early Rome is another area where legends and historical reality intertwine uncomfortably. The stories of Rhea Silvia, the Sabine women, Lucretia, and others present women primarily as passive victims or as catalysts for male action. Yet these same stories also suggest that women had significant social roles and that violence against women could provoke political upheaval. Etruscan women seem to have enjoyed more equality and public presence than women in classical Greek society. And some of this may have influenced Rome during the period of Etruscan domination. One thing modern scholarship has clearly established is that Rome's development was not unique or exceptional. Similar processes of urbanization, state formation, and cultural synthesis were occurring throughout central Italy during the same period. Other Latin cities, Etruscan city-states, and Italic communities were all experiencing comparable transformations. Rome was part of a broader Iron Age Mediterranean world, characterized by increasing social complexity, trade networks, military competition, and cultural exchange. What eventually distinguished Rome was not any inherent superiority or divine favor, despite what Romans themselves believed, but rather a combination of factors: its strategic location, its political flexibility in incorporating conquered peoples as citizens rather than merely subjects, its military and political institutions that proved remarkably adaptable, and the contingencies of historical circumstance. If certain battles had gone differently, if certain decisions had been made otherwise, Rome might have remained just another Italian city-state. Instead, it became the foundation of Western civilization. Conclusion: legacy and the eternal power of Rome's origin story. We began this journey deep in a marshy valley between two hills, where the Roman Forum would eventually stand. We've traveled through centuries and across the boundary between myth and history, encountering gods and heroes, archaeological evidence and scholarly debates. We've seen how a cluster of Iron Age villages on hilltops beside the Tiber River grew into the greatest city of the ancient world. The question we posed at the beginning, whether Rome was founded by twin brothers raised by a wolf or emerged gradually from the merger of settlements, turns out to be less simple than it first appeared. Both narratives contain truth. The archaeological reality is that Rome developed over time, through processes of urbanization, political consolidation, and cultural synthesis common to many societies. But the mythological narrative is also true in its own way, capturing how Romans understood themselves, expressing their values and ideals, shaping their institutions and destiny. Rome's foundation story is ultimately about transformation and synthesis. Troy falls, but Aeneas survives to found a new civilization. Separate hilltop villages merge into a unified city. Latins and Sabines become a single people. Foreign Etruscan kings bring knowledge and sophistication that Rome absorbs. and makes its own. The monarchy gives way to the republic, transforming political structures while maintaining cultural continuity. At every stage, Rome takes what exists and reshapes it into something new and greater. This pattern of transformation and synthesis would characterize Roman history for more than 1,000 years. As Rome expanded across Italy, the Mediterranean, and eventually much of the known world, it continued to absorb and integrate different peoples, cultures, and traditions. It took military tactics from the Samnites, philosophy from the Greeks, engineering from the Etruscans, legal concepts from various sources, and fused them all into something distinctly Roman. The city, founded on 7 hills, became an empire spanning 3 continents, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, but unified by Roman law, Roman military power, and Roman culture. The foundation myths provided Romans with a framework for understanding this process. If Rome itself had begun as a mixture of different peoples, united by common institutions and shared destiny, then Rome's expansion could be seen not as conquest, but as extended integration. Defeated enemies could become Roman citizens. Their gods could be added to the Roman pantheon. Their customs could be incorporated into Roman practice. The empire grew not just through military might, but through this remarkable capacity for assimilation. The values embedded in the foundation myths, particularly the later Republican story of Brutus and Lucretia, also shaped Roman political culture. The hatred of tyranny, the emphasis on civic virtue, the willingness to sacrifice personal interest for the public good, the importance of honor and duty. All these themes from the founding narratives were reinforced throughout Roman education and literature. When Romans faced political crises, they looked back to these foundational stories for guidance and inspiration. The influence of Rome's foundation myths extended far beyond Rome itself. As Roman culture spread across the ancient world, so did its stories. When the Roman Empire eventually fell in the West, its cultural legacy persisted. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans saw themselves as Rome's heirs, studying Latin, imitating Roman architecture, and retelling Roman stories. The tale of Romulus and Remus, Aeneas's journey, the rape of Lucretia, all became part of the common cultural heritage of European civilization. In the modern world, Rome's influence remains pervasive. Our languages derive from Latin or show heavy Latin influence. Our legal systems trace their roots to Roman law. Our political institutions, particularly republican and democratic forms of government, owe much to Roman precedents. Our architecture incorporates Roman elements. Our very calendar comes to us from Rome, reformed by Julius Caesar and later Pope Gregory, but still fundamentally Roman in structure. The foundation myths themselves continue to fascinate. Artists and writers still draw on them for inspiration. Scholars still debate their meaning and historical basis. Tourists still flock to Rome to walk where Romans walked, to see the Forum where Brutus rallied the people against tyranny, to climb the Palatine where Romulus supposedly founded his city. The stories retain their power to move and inspire us more than 2 millennia after they were first told. Perhaps this enduring appeal stems from what the myths represent. The possibility of creating something great from humble beginnings, of founding a civilization on principles of justice and virtue, of transforming the world through human will and divine favor. Or perhaps it's the darker elements that fascinate us. The fratricide that inaugurated Rome's history, the violence and treachery that accompanied its rise, the reminder that greatness often comes at terrible cost. Whatever the reason, Rome's foundation story remains one of humanity's great narratives. It connects us to our past, helps us understand the present, and perhaps offers lessons for the future. In a world that seems increasingly fragmented and divided, Rome's story of diverse peoples coming together to build something greater than themselves, of transforming competition and conflict into cooperation and unity, may have continuing relevance. The archaeological work continues on the Palatine Hill, in the Forum, throughout Rome and across Italy. Each excavation season brings new discoveries, new data, new questions. Perhaps future work will provide clearer answers about exactly what happened in the 8th century before the Common Era. Or perhaps the truth will always remain elusive, hidden beneath layers of later construction and centuries of storytelling. Maybe that's as it should be. Some mysteries are more valuable for the questions they provoke than any definitive answer could be. What we can say with certainty is that Rome was founded, whether by Romulus on the 21st of April, 753 years before the Common Era, or through the gradual merger of Iron Age villages over the course of the 8th and 7th centuries, or in some way that combines elements of both narratives. From whatever beginning, Rome grew into something extraordinary, a civilization that shaped the ancient world and continues to influence our own time. The specific details of its founding may be lost to history, but the legacy of what it became remains vividly present. As we stand in the Forum today, surrounded by tourists and toppled columns, it requires an act of imagination to envision what this place once was. The marble temples gleaming in the sun, the crowds of citizens gathering to hear political speeches, the religious processions winding through the streets, the senators in their togas debating the fate of nations. And beyond that, it requires an even greater imaginative leap to see back to the earliest days, when this valley was marshy and undeveloped, when simple huts dotted the surrounding hills, when Rome was nothing but a possibility waiting to be realized. But perhaps that's the most important lesson of Rome's foundation story, that great civilizations begin with small beginnings, that cities are built not by gods or heroes, but by ordinary people making extraordinary commitments, that history is not predetermined, but shaped by human choices and actions. Rome was not destined to be great, simply because Romulus claimed descent from Mars and Venus. It became great through centuries of work, struggle, sacrifice, and innovation by countless generations of Romans who believed in their city and devoted themselves to its success. So when we ask whether Rome was founded by Romulus or by the gradual urbanization of Latin villages, perhaps the answer is yes. Yes to myth and yes to history. Yes to divine destiny and yes to human effort. Yes to sudden transformation and yes to gradual evolution. Rome was founded in all these ways, and its foundation continues to echo through the ages. Sank! If you've enjoyed learning about the founding of Rome and the fascinating interplay between myth and archaeological reality, please consider subscribing to Ancient Curiosities. We explore the forgotten worlds and lost civilizations of the ancient past, bringing you deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. Like this video if you found it informative. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Rome's foundation. And check out our other videos on ancient civilizations. Until next time, keep exploring the ancient world.